Hi there, folks. If you're just joining us, this is our Connected Conservation monthly webinar series. We'll get started in just a few minutes, so you can sit tight. While you're waiting, we did plug a couple of links into the chat box. You can feel free to peruse our DOI online resource toolkit while you're waiting, which is open to all DOI employees, as well as see some of our resources on the Network for Landscape Conservation site. In addition to that, we also added a few handouts into the GoToWebinar panel, so you should have access to those as well. So feel free to open those up if you're interested in just taking the time to look through those while we wait for the presentation to start. Okay, let's go ahead and get started with our monthly webinar. My name is Cass Hardy, and I work for the Biological Resource Division within the National Park Service, and I serve as the team lead for our Connected Conservation Community of Practice. We're the ones who host our monthly webinar series and have put together a lot of resources for the National Park Service on connected conservation or landscape scale conservation. Our goal with our webinars is to expose existing tools or practices that enable landscape conservation or connected conservation for both our parks and programs. And we record all of our webinars, so we have a bank of resources that are available on both of our internal toolkit that's open to all of DOI employees, and that link is in our chat box. They're also hosted on the Network for Landscape Conservation YouTube channel and on their website, which is also in the chat box, a link to that site as well. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're really excited about this presentation. Throughout the presentation, we will have a couple of polls that we'll ask the audience to take. And there is a question box, so if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to pop them in the box there, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. We'll also open up all the lines at the end so that folks can speak up and ask questions as needed as well. So with that said, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Kevin Halsey. He's a principal consultant with Ecometric Solutions Group. He leads the development of the ecosystem services decision support tools that were created by ESG, and he'll be giving our presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Kevin, and we'll have the presentation and then again open up the lines for Q&A at the end. It's all yours, Kevin.
Thank you, Cass. Thank you, Cass. So we wanted to start off with a poll at the beginning just to get a feel for how many people out there have experience using ecosystem service measurement tools specifically. So just to kind of get a feel, I know you guys are, this forum is all about using tools and approaches. Just wondering how many of you have experience with ecosystem service tools. So we're going to do that, and while you're taking that poll, just a little bit about ESG and the ESII Tool. ESG is a small company based out of Montana. We focus on doing ecosystem service analysis and developing ecosystem service measurement tools. The ESII Tool is a tool that we built in collaboration with Dow and the Nature Conservancy. It was something that that Dow actually was looking for a way to integrate nature into their decision-making process. And through that collaboration with TNC, they brought us in to help create, using that to track progress towards a nature goal that they've adopted, where they've said they're going to save $1 billion by making sure they're actually bringing nature into their decision process and thinking in a more concerted manner about are they actually doing the right thing with the natural areas that surround them. So that's basically was the start of the ESII Tool. The ESII Tool is, okay, and I think we're back to the presentation now. And Morgan, if you go ahead to the next slide. So the ESII Tool is, as I was saying, is currently being used by Dow. The ESII Tool, because it was built on behalf of Dow, is somewhat Dow-centric at the moment, but the intent of the tool is to be able to expand and grow. It is modular, and so we can put new and different ecosystem services in to address the context of different users. The tool is free for the public to use. The intent is, as people invest in developing new services and new functions and new functionality within the tool, that all gets put back into the tool, and that then also becomes made freely available to the public. So hopefully it'll grow and expand over time and become a more useful tool in a broader set of contexts. Morgan, let's go to the next slide. I don't have enough time to spend a lot of time going into detail about the tool, but I do want to have a couple of slides just to give you this sense for how it was built and how it works. This graphic here basically is the framework that underlies the ESII Tool. The tool is intended to quantify ecosystem services. So it doesn't actually measure value specifically, but it's designed to express ecosystem service production in a way, in actually several different ways that will feed into different types of evaluation processes. So we produce a percent performance output that allows you to look at a broad suite of ecosystem services and compare the changes in performance to those services based on management activities on the landscape, so that you can see the trade-offs that are going to occur. So you can really look at, are you addressing priorities? Are you really looking at benefiting the services that are most needed in that particular location? So if that's the way you want to think about value, it enables you to do that. But we also have an output that we call an engineering unit, which is basically taking more of an absolute measure of performance. So for example, for water quantity control, it measures gallons per day that leave the site. It measures so everything in the same way that an engineer would. So if you're looking to do more of a replacement cost analysis, it can feed into that. So while it doesn't do valuation, it's designed to feed easily into different types of valuation processes. And how it's structured is basically what you see here with this cascade. We have two tiers of modeling, one that shows how ecological functions come together to create these benefits that the landscape provides that we then quantify. And then a second tier of modeling that looks at how the landscape attributes, vegetative structure, soil composition, water regime, topography, things of that sort, how those come together to really enable those ecological functions to be performed. So we have two tiers of modeling. We start with data inputs at the landscape attribute level. We measure those different things. We then measure how ecological performance is occurring within on the landscape, and then we look at how those ecological functions come together to produce those benefits that we want to measure. Okay, Morgan, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we talked about two tiers of modeling. Let's just take an example, water quantity control. We've got three functions that feed into that. There's actually a fourth one as well, water conveyance, which can also be added to it. But basically we're looking at kind of the life history of a raindrop. As it's falling out of the sky, there's the potential it's going to be intercepted and re-evaporated into the atmosphere. There's a chance that there will be flow through or rain that's actually hits the ground. That may be infiltrated. If it's not infiltrated, it's probably going to run off unless it's captured and stored somewhere. And if none of those things happen, then the raindrop will eventually make its way into a channel of some sort. So those are the three processes that we measure. But then to just dive into one, looking at infiltration, looking at how infiltration occurs, you can see the different attributes and how those, and the attributes that we measure to understand how that functional process occurs. Basically, at each of these levels, we create a concept model that helps us understand the relationship between the attributes, how much each attribute is contributing to the particular function, and the relationship between them, those types of things. Basically, from that point, once we've identified what those attributes are, then we'll go in and score those for each of the specific functions that they're contributing to. So each attribute has a different scoring function that we're looking at. So we'll look at how adding or subtracting those attributes to the system will change performance of that function. And that's all the more I'm going to go into the actual science behind it, but we're happy to do follow-up conversations with people if they have an interest in that. So Morgan, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the tool itself, I just want to do some introduction to what the tool looks like, how it's structured, what it actually, tool using it. First off, there are two parts to it. There's the project workspace. That's where all the models are housed. That's where you go in and you can do project setup, identify your project area, and get everything set, get all the mapping set. And then the ESII Field app, which is for data collection. So once you've set up your project area in the project workspace, you can sync the Field app with the project workspace, and all of that project information that you set up at the beginning will go into the Field app, and then you can go out into the field with the Field app and do the actual data collection. Morgan, let's go to the next slide, and we can kind of get into a little more specifics on that. With the Field app, the Field app is something, you have to have an iPad to use the Field app. If you don't have an iPad, we also just have a paper data sheet that you can use that is every bit as useful. But the thing about the app is the app is structured to really make data collection as easy as possible. What Dow was looking for with this product was something where they could take it to any of their facilities, hand it to their site manager, and whether that person has an ecological background or not, they could go out and do data collection. So all of the attributes, the questions around the attributes are all picture-based. There are help tools that make it easier for people to understand the intent of the question, and that provides helpful suggestions for how to actually measure that particular attribute. Okay, Morgan, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so once you've gone through and you've collected all the data for different map units, and that's something actually I should say is when we collect data for polygons that have relative homogeneity of attributes. So when you go out to a site, you may have 10, 20, 30 different map units, depending on how much you want to lump them split. And that's something that's left up to the user. The more you lump, the more uncertainty you are accepting into your final output. The more you split, the longer it's going to take you to do the data collection. So that's something that you can gauge yourself to kind of strike that proper balance. What you can see here is after you've collected all the data for all the map units, then you can upload that data back up into the project workspace. Now the project workspace has all of that data. You can run the models. You can go in and do any cleanup that you need to. Maybe it was raining when you're out in the field, and so you kind of had to hurry through a few things. Well, you can go in and clean it up when you get back into the office. And then once you're happy with the data, you've QC'd it and you're comfortable, then you can do the model runs. Okay, Morgan, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so one of the really nice things about the tool is it is really helpful for measuring baseline performance, for understanding the landscape and how it's performing. But the really big thing is it allows you to run scenarios, to go in and create new scenarios and change the attribute conditions within those different map units, change the map unit boundaries, basically reconfigure the site to be whatever you want it to be in the future. And you can do as many scenarios as you want and start to see, well, what are the outcomes there? What is the trade-off I'm going to see in terms of ecosystem service performance, and what's that level of performance that I can anticipate? This is just from a project that we did with the Forest Service and the Flathead National Forest. It was just we asked them if we could do a case study on one of their management areas, and this is about a 4,500 acre area. You can see the number of map units that we ended up with on this site. And the idea was, well, let's look at putting in some recreational trails, some mountain biking trails. And let's see what that does to performance of these different services. And you can see that as you go in and put these trails in, the ability of that area to provide good recreational support goes up, but many other things go down. So for instance, you're more likely to have erosion and some things like that. But the key element here is just the ability to go in and use the tool to look at different scenarios, see how management activities are going to change the site. Okay, Morgan, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so okay, so in addition to having multiple types of units that we express the outputs in so that you can feed into different valuation processes, we also have different ways of looking at the outputs from a format standpoint. So once you've gone in, you've collected your baseline, you've got all of your scenarios. Now you can go in and look at those outputs and do comparisons, and you can do it in a variety of ways. You can see those red arrows around things. You can go in and click on reports. When you click on reports, it gives you these three different formats. You can either look at the outputs in a tabular format, in a chart or graph, and then spatially through a map, through what we call a heat map. So, and those all have different uses. If you really want to get detailed and you're doing QC and you want to make sure you understand the outputs, using that tabular format is really good. But if you're doing a presentation to management, showing this big table with all these outputs, really bad. Right, so the chart format tends to be more helpful for that. But then when you're thinking about ecosystem services, the location really matters. So is the service being produced in proximity to the receptor that needs that benefit? If you're doing, if you're using this for siting a development or restoration of some sort, are you focused on the right areas for either impacts or restoration? Right? This really tells you where on the site you can do something without having more of an effect. So that spatial analysis is always really, really useful. And either the charts or the heat maps are good when you're working with stakeholders and trying to give them a good visual representation of outcomes. Okay, Morgan, let's go to the next slide. So we've used this in a variety of contexts. It was originally intended to be a site level tool, and by site level, we didn't really bound that or define how big an area that could be, but it's an area where you can do data collection in the amount of time that you have available for data collection. But we recently also started looking at different ways we could expand the application of the tool and use it more at a watershed scale. So this is a project that we just finished in Java, where we're doing a watershed characterization to help them with flood risk reduction. And what we did was basically found land cover mapping for the watershed, for the basin, and looked around the basin and identified what are those basic land cover types that really capture at least 80% of what's out there within the basin, and characterizes it pretty closely. So where would we need to split and maybe get a little finer? Where are we okay lumping? And basically, we turned those into typicals and did data collection at a number of different sites for each of those typicals around the basin, and then applied those results to the land use mapping. So you can see that's actually a heat map that we produced using that approach of the entire watershed. And you can see the darker the green, the better it's performing that function. We were looking at water quantity control because it was a flood risk reduction project. But then we also used the engineering unit capacity of the tool to actually measure, so how much water is actually coming out of that upper basin. And just a background here, that kind of big red blotch at the north, that's Semarang City. That entire area is just urban and has been experiencing a lot of flooding. And that flooding has been increasing of late because that urbanization has been spreading to the south. And the more urbanized it becomes, the more flooding they receive. So basically we were just looking at how much water would be coming out of that upper basin. So, and I think that's it. For now, we'd love to take questions if anybody has questions. And yeah, I'm not sure if any showed up in the chat or not.
Great, thanks so much, Kevin. We'll go ahead and start that second poll that we have, which is just, do you see the tool as potentially being relevant to your work? And while that's while the poll is being launched, we'll open up all the lines so folks can speak up and ask questions. Kevin, just out of curiosity, or get us started while people are taking the poll, have you done much work with the Park Service yet? I know you had referenced an example with the Forest Service, but where have you seen it applicable with parks so far?
We haven't actually had an opportunity to do any work with the Park Service yet. I think there's a lot of applicability. Just the basic concept of ecosystem services, I think, is one that's very useful to park decision making. And because that's the case, I think that the tool could be useful for different planning projects, different just different endeavors. You know, in particular, with parks, you're looking at a very broad stakeholder base, and so understanding, you know, the benefits the park is producing for those stakeholders and how to really optimize those. I think the tool would provide a lot of value for that. Great.
We did have one question come in asking about the recording of the webinar, and yes, we do record all of our webinars. It'll be available both on our internal toolkit as well as on the Network for Landscape Conservation site. And we'll send a message out to all attendees with the link to that recording as well. One other question in the question box, and the lines have been open, so just know, folks, that your line is unmuted. And after we ask this question, we'll ask anyone else to speak up as well. What about the Itree tools? These tools are used by the Forest Service.
Yeah, so Itree is actually embedded within one of the services that we look at. We have a air quality particulate model that actually builds off of, incorporates Itree, which I think was a good model. It's something, you know, depending on the level of data you have, it actually produces a reasonable output, and that's something that we built off of within this.
Okay. Other questions from participants? And again, everyone's line should be open, so feel free to speak up.
Hi there, this is Brian Fainer with the Park Service. I was wondering if this tool has been used or applied in the context of giving credit, you know, for carbon capture under the, you know, all the international work on climate change, you know, for like in the Amazon, giving, trying to come up with a way to give, you know, credit again to, you know, for protecting forests, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're currently doing a project in the Congo, within the Congo rainforest, where we're looking at that as a potential opportunity that we'd build on. The thing I would say about that is that the tool hasn't been used for that yet. And the way the services are currently structured, I don't think it would be that good for it, because we're only measuring carbon sequestration. So we're not capturing soil carbon. It's really more vegetation, how vegetation growth affects carbon capture. The reason for that is basically that Dow didn't want to get too far down that path. They were already doing reporting around carbon and didn't want something that might be conflicting with that. So carbon wasn't a primary focus, but it's one where I'm hoping we'll be doing some expansion, and the Congo project that we're doing might provide some opportunity for that. We'll see.
Another question in the box here, what are the other tools embedded in the tool?
We have a couple of other tools that we've made use of. The TR55, which is a NRCS stormwater flow. We have so for the water quantity, we've got a model that we developed, which I think actually provides a more sensitive output in terms of runoff response from a map unit, but our model wasn't calibrated to an actual gallons per day of flow that would result from that. So we fell back on, for our engineering unit, making use of the TR55. We have some other basic engineering equations, not so much models, but some of the Manning's equation for roughness and our conveyance capacity function, some things like that. But those are the only two models, existing models that are out there that I can think of.
Great.
Actually, Morgan, did we use one for visual inclusion?
I think when we were originally putting together our visual occlusion model, we did incorporate some work from some spatial modeling work from a university. I'd have to go back and look at our documentation to figure out who that was. But yeah, we did bring in somebody else's visual model for that.
And we do have a couple more questions in the box, but do any of the participants want to speak up and ask a question?
Hey, this is Brian again. I had another quick question, and I was wondering if cities or community groups have used the tool to justify investments in green infrastructure.
So Dow has been doing a lot of that. Because that's how they're capturing their nature goal is they're measuring the cost savings they get from investing in green infrastructure, investing in the performance nature's currently providing at their facilities. The other place we've been seeing it is biomimicry and some of the green build. So biomimicry is doing a big urban development push, trying to make urban areas more capable of producing the ecosystem services that people need. And they've been using the tool to try to identify how to integrate those natural components into the urban landscape. And TNC has been using it as well for that purpose.
Another question from the audience? Okay, another question from our box. How large of a landscape have you applied the tool to?
So the Samaring project is the largest area that we've done so far. I think so. The key is I think it's very applicable at a regional level where you have a certain homogeneity within land cover types. So your forests are a particular forest type, right? So trying to use it at a national scale, you're going to end up having a lot of so many different land cover types that it would take a while. But really, I mean, it depends on how much you're willing to split those land cover types down, right? And where we found it to be most easily applicable is where you're working within a region where there is relative homogeneity between different forest types, between meadow communities, between those types of things. Morgan, how many square kilometers is the Semmering Basin?
Ooh, in square kilometers, I'm not sure. I think it was 30,000 hectares.
Okay, yeah, so that's 30,000 hectares is currently the biggest that we've done. The other issue that becomes that you have to start worrying about is the size of the mapping. By size, I mean the file size. We have some upper limits that we've started to run into as we try to get into bigger and bigger areas. We could go bigger than the Semmering Basin, but at some point we start bumping up against the file size issues.
Great. And one last question in the question box, and then we can wrap it up for today. Is the model mainly focused on water quality and air quality benefits?
That's a good question. So the initial suite of services were ones that were identified by Dow. They include air quality, water quality. They also include aesthetics, but they include aesthetics from Dow's perspective, which is very much a visual and noise masking and screening. So is nature providing a barrier between communities and their facilities? So it's not the type of aesthetic production you would think of in a park context or a scenic area. It also includes erosion and let's see, so water quality, water quantity, climate regulation from the carbon that I was mentioning earlier, but then also a temperature regulation, so more of a localized climate effects. And I believe that's it for now. But as I said, that's something where the more people we get using it, and this has only been out for a short time now, so we haven't had a lot of expansion yet. We've had a few opportunities to grow it and add things in, and we're going to continue to do that. But the hope is that we can start to get more recreational, cultural services. That same project I was talking about in the Congo, one of the major focuses of that project is going to be cultural heritage, because it's in an area where there's been so much displacement. So we're going to be trying to turn that into a quantification where we can actually get that as a service that we're measuring. So some of those social, cultural, recreational services we really are wanting to have be a focus that we start getting into the tool. But for now, there's just those 8 primary services.
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin and Kenna and Morgan, for the excellent presentation. Once again, the presentation was recorded and we'll be uploading it right after we close out the webinar today to both our internal site and our Network for Landscape Conservation page. And then as a follow-up, we did add in a few handouts into the GoToWebinar panel, so feel free to download those. We'll also send those as a follow-up with the link to the webinar, just to give you a little more information about the tools that were referred to today. And once again, thank you so much for joining us. It's always great to have folks tune in to the webinars that we're hosting. Our next webinar is scheduled for May 16th. We'll be focusing on the Continental Divide Trail, and it should be a really excellent webinar. It'll also include the partner organization that the Conservancy that helps to benefit the Continental Divide Trail. So please plan to tune in for that as well. Okay, thanks so much, everyone, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you, Cass.